The succession to Prophet Muhammad raises questions about the leadership of Islam after his demise. Who should have been Prophet Muhammad's successor? How should he have been selected? Was it for the people to elect their leader, or was it for Allah and his Prophet to choose? What were the conditions of legitimacy, and most importantly, what was the role of the Caliph, the successor? Answers to these questions have led to divisions in the Muslim community since the first century of Muslim history, giving rise to the Sunni and Shi'i schools. Today, certain groups claim to have set up an Islamic state headed by the self-declared Caliph Abu Bakr Baghdadi. How is this so-called Islamic state and Caliph to be viewed in light of Islamic theology and history? My name is Rebecca Masterton, and I have met academics and scholars from prominent universities to try to understand what really happened after the demise of Prophet Muhammad. Important events we need to look at are Ghadir Khum, the Prophet's illness and his last few days, his demise and burial, and the events after his burial leading to the leadership of Abu Bakr.
The discussion about succession to the Holy Prophet ﷺ is an integral discussion that is not political but purely religious, and not only religious, it actually deals with the usuluddin, the aqidah, the belief. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which is accepted by all Muslims: anyone who dies without an allegiance to an imam, then he will die as a time of ignorance. The question is, who is this imam that we have to follow? And I have to have an allegiance to him. If I don't, then I will die as a time of ignorance.
The succession to the Prophet was seen as a grand cosmological event. It was intended to be a grand cosmological event whereby the believers, the faithful, were now ready to be initiated into the esoteric secrets of the cosmos. They were ready to be initiated into the inner dimension of Islam, but that was taken away.
I think we have to say quite honestly that all history is written from a certain perspective. There's no such thing as neutral history, and that therefore one stream of historical research will always maintain not the prior claim of Ali, but the divine appointment of Ali. So it's not his choice. When the Prophet names him as his successor, he speaks not of his own will, but through the will of God. So he's always the mouthpiece in that sense. And those traditions are there, that history is there. There is another tradition that says that those events are misinterpreted in the Shia sources, in the Shia community. There is another interpretation on those events, and that interpretation is that neither God nor the Prophet appointed a successor, and that Abu Bakr was, as I say, a trusted, close companion of the Prophet. He asked him to lead the prayers, but I don't think that we could say that there is a strong Sunni position to say that is a designation of Abu Bakr as his successor. It is just a sign that he was an elder, respected member of the community. And so I think my understanding from the Sunni position is to say that God and his messenger are silent. I think that we have to accept that if this was something that was going to be easily resolved, it would have happened at some stage in the last 1400 years. And so to think that we are going to resolve an issue which has divided the Muslim community for 1400 years is very difficult. I think that we have to apply a degree of honest modern scholarship. We know, for example, that there were hadith made up and attributed to the Prophet. We know that isnad were invented in order to defend certain positions and certain schools. it's not always done with malevolence. You see, if I think that you're going to go seriously astray, why should you believe Chris Hewer? But if I can say, but there is a narration of the Prophet that says you're likely to take much more notice. So I can be doing it for the very best of reasons, but it doesn't necessarily make it an authentic narration.
Who were the main writers of Islamic history? What are the historical texts upon which historians rely in order to piece together the history of the succession of Prophet Muhammad? It could be argued that histories from both Proto-Shi'i and Proto-Sunni historians are always going to be biased one way or another. What method could be used to try to approach a balanced picture of what happened with the issue of the succession? History tells us that a small gathering of prominent companions attended the hall of Bani Sa'ida, or Saqifa Bani Sa'ida as it was known. Abu Bakr was nominated to lead the community and he became the first caliph. This choice was disputed by other companions of Prophet Muhammad who believed that he had chosen Ali as his successor.
Unlike jurists or theologians, being a historian was not a well-paid job unless you served a certain political master, unless you worked in a particular court or you received patronage from a sultan. And naturally, if you were to toe a particular line, if you were to align yourself with a particular dynasty or an empire, then you were little more than a propagandist, a very articulate propagandist. So we have to take that into account, that there are different ways of writing history. There are narratives which are imperial, there are narratives which are romantic, there are narratives which are traditional, there are narratives which offer revisionist accounts, which for many decades in Islamic studies, they were neglected. So for example, the Shi'i narrative of early Islamic history was dismissed by many Western scholars because it was assumed to be apocryphal, partisan, and because the Shi'is were seen through the lens of medieval Sunni theologians, and hence they were considered to be heretical. That has been challenged recently, particularly by scholars and historians in France, who insist that actually the Shi'i revisionist account of history could serve a purpose, because more often than not, those writers did not toe the line of the political elite, and they offered events which reflect a certain tendency often ignored or overlooked by the traditional histories.
There is an important element in Hadith criticism that sometimes things are written in order to defend a certain position. Given what happens, given the animosity that comes up with the persons of Abu Bakr and Umar especially, in the Alid Abbasid debates and so on, one could well see that there would be a fertile seedbed for any kind of hadith that could be attributed to say that the greatest after me will be these two characters. We just don't know, but these are the kind of issues that we have to look at.
The first question I was going to ask is with regard to the compilation of the historical texts, because it seems that the accounts of what happened at Saqifa were not written down until the first or second caliphate during the Abbasid period. Do you think that there would have been a reason why the Abbasids wanted these accounts to be written down?
I think my view would be that this isn't necessarily driven by the Abbasid caliphs themselves, but particularly by the sort of early 9th century, what you begin to see emerging is the group that we come to call the ulama, or the religious scholars, as a sort of identifiable cohort within society. And this group of scholars are quite keen to compete with the Abbasid caliph in terms of defining doctrine. They feel that they are better repositories of that truth than the caliphs. And one of the ways in which they begin to contest that right to define doctrine with the Abbasid caliphs is through having a written canon. And this is a phase in which we also see the beginnings of what one might call a book culture in Baghdad and in the Islamic world more generally. So it's at this point that what had previously been oral reports about the life of the Prophet, about the experience of the early Muslim community, about the conquests, begins to be written down in a number of different pieces of writing, the hadith collections, maghazi collections of reports about campaigns, of the seerah or biography of the Prophet himself. And through creating this canon, which the ulama know and are very learned in, they begin to sort of build up this body of material which they then control and pronounce on at the expense of the caliph.
Also looking at the early historical compilations of the events at the time of the succession of Prophet Muhammad, we can see that there were proto-Shi'i historians and there were proto-Sunni historians, and they were both quite selective with regard to the events that they compiled in their histories. But then we come to At-Tabari, and he seems to have been more open or more inclusive of the different accounts of these events. Was this perhaps a reflection of the time that he was living in?
Yeah, I think At-Tabari sort of stands out as quite an independent thinker, and I think that he was engaging with some of the same issues that we may have, in the sense he was aware that if as a historian, you select from a number of different versions, or if you synthesize them into a single version, you create something that may not really reflect the truth. And I think he was very sensitive to where the truth might lie, and didn't feel that he himself, as a mere mortal, could determine that, and that he wanted to present a range of different accounts for different events to allow the reader, if you like, to come to their own decisions and be aware that there were these different positions, these different views. He was probably sensitive to the fact as well that he was writing, around 200 years after the death of the Prophet.
When we look at the accounts that have been given of the events of Saqifa, it's quite interesting to see that Omar says that Bani Hashim were trying to illegally appropriate the right that belonged to Quraysh in terms of authority over the people, and yet Bani Hashim themselves were also a clan from among the Quraysh. Do you think that perhaps Omar's statement was an attempt to isolate Bani Hashim in some way?
I think it's very difficult to know exactly what Omar does mean by the phrase, the people. One could take it to mean Quraysh as an entire tribe, and one would need to remember then that it was the Quraysh as a whole who administered the pagan shrine in pre-Islamic Mecca. So they tended to feel that as a tribe they had a right to power, that clans within the tribe shouldn't necessarily monopolize power. However, one could also see Umar saying the people in the sense of the early Muslims, the early Muhajirun. And from that perspective, then he's referring to the group who are considered to have precedence or sabaqa within Islam, the group of early converts, of which, of course, he was part, Abu Bakr was part, Ali was part, that small group around the Prophet himself. So he may be discussing the point, sort of through these reports, of should it be succession via blood, or should it be succession via precedence, and those who had been close to the Prophet choosing a successor rather than a lineal successor being appointed.
We can see that in the Sunni Hadith collections there are many narrations praising Abu Bakr and Umar, and of course Sunnis refer to these in order to reject the Shi'i position. So we have, as an example, related by Hakim Tirmidhi, Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Majah, a narration attributed to the Holy Prophet where he says, "You should, after my death, follow the way of Abu Bakr and Umar." And we also have another narration in Bukhari from Abu Huraira saying, "Among the nation of Bani Israel who lived before you, there were men who used to be inspired with guidance, though they were not of prophets. And if there had been any such persons among my followers, it is Umar. That's a very famous one. We've also got another famous one by Anas ibn Malik about where the Holy Prophet climbed the mountain in Uhud with Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman, and then the mountain shook with them, and then the Holy Prophet said, "Be firm, O Uhud, for on you there are no more than a Prophet, a Siddiq, and 2 martyrs." I mean, so the books, obviously the Sunni collections, are full of praise for Abu Bakr and Umar. And of course, because of this praise, it has become an accepted truth, we could say, that Abu Bakr was the closest companion of the Holy Prophet, etc. So why is it that Shi'i scholars reject these? I mean, some people would say, well, it's just out of their opinion, it's just out of their political position. I mean, is there a rational scientific reason as to why they reject these?
Generally, during and immediately after the death of the Prophet, there were 2 very strong personalities, both of whom were responsible for disseminating a particular view of Muhammad and a particular view of who should succeed Muhammad. On the one hand, you had the daughter of Abu Bakr, Aisha, who was also the wife of the Prophet. And on the other, you had Abdullah ibn Abbas, who was a cousin, as you know, and from the Banu Hashim. Historians notice that most traditions that survive in the Sunni canons, in the Sunni Hadith literature, where Abu Bakr is praised, where Abu Bakr is portrayed as a gentle individual, as a possessor of this well-respected Arab quality known as hilm, as the worthy successor. It's almost always, without exception, a tradition reported by Aisha. And Aisha went to great lengths to try and carefully cultivate a particular image of her father. In fact, the famous tradition used in Shia Sunni polemics, whereby Abu Bakr was told to lead the prayers during the Prophet's last days and when he was overcome by illness. There are 2 versions. One narrated by Aisha, where Abu Bakr is singled out as this praiseworthy individual, and the other version narrated by Ibn Abbas, which undercuts slightly the character of Abu Bakr. And likewise, of course, the image of Ali and the Banu Hashim was promoted and often, polished, if you like, glossed over by Ibn Abbas. So we had 2 very strong personalities who despised each other, who were enemies. And it's no secret that Abu Bakr and Aisha had a very hostile, acrimonious relationship with the Banu Hashim, the immediate family of the Prophet. For any student of history, this is a well-known fact. And it was those 2 individuals who polarized the nascent Muslim community immediately before the death of the Prophet and immediately after.
One of the objections that people make with regard to the idea that Abu Bakr and Umar usurped the succession of Imam Ali is the question of how the Holy Prophet could not have known the real nature of 2 people who are meant to have been his closest companions for many years. I'm going to be asking you about your perspective on the succession to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, based upon your research. And one of the first questions I was going to go into is what you have picked up with regards to the personalities, the characteristics of the first 4 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman and Ali. Just to begin with, if you could explain some of your impressions of their personalities.
The thing about Abu Bakr, first of all, is that he is one of the early Muslims. He's an early convert to follow the Prophet. And he is somebody who actually takes financial loss. He suffers because of his following of the Prophet. And although he's not tortured himself, for example, nevertheless, there is quite a considerable cost to his following. He is someone who is always seen as being close to the Prophet, journeying with him, supporting him during the time when the Prophet's clan were put under the ban. He was there trying to help whenever he could, and so on. Now, Umar is really a very different character. Everybody agrees that Umar is a brighter, a cleverer individual, a more intelligent person, but also a much more volatile character. And Umar was the kind of person who would shout and roar if he really didn't like what was going on. And indeed, we're told that was the way that he came to Islam, that he heard his sister and her husband reading from a parchment of the Quran and stormed in and went wild. And then, after the message touched his heart, he then embraced Islam and came to be a follower of the Prophet. Now, when we look at Uthman, he emerges through the shura, we can say, which has been set up by Umar in order to decide his successor. The history books, I think, are fairly clear in saying that you can really divide Uthman's caliphate into two parts. The first part being really following in the way of his two successors, a more egalitarian, a more Islamic way of conduct. But then in the last part of his caliphate, the last 6 years, he really he comes more to play the old Umayyad card. He goes back to his Meccan aristocratic clan roots. And indeed, in many ways, that's what brings about his downfall, and that's what brings about his death. Now, throughout the whole of this period, of course, Ali is there in the background, and according to Shia understanding, should have been there in the foreground. And so we know that Ali is one of, if not the first male, certainly one of the very first male converts to Islam, that he embraces Islam as a young boy, and according to the Shia sources, he is told at that first embrace that he is to be the successor of the Prophet. And therefore we see in Ali a very sensitive, sensible, wise observer. He is observing, as we might say, the sunnah of the Prophet. He is drinking in the message of Islam as it is exemplified in his life. He is noted by all schools as being a great warrior, often going out in single-handed combat, often combining his skill in warfare with a high ethical conduct. He marries the daughter of the Prophet, and therefore that closeness which they naturally had by being the cousin of the Prophet is then reinforced. And also we see a certain high nobility, because even if we're not looking from the Shia perspective, which would see him actually withdrawing from demanding his rights to succeed the Prophet in order that there shouldn't be a great civil war, a tumult within the community. But even if we look from the Sunni sources, we don't see him there as somebody who is belligerently chipping away in the background and trying to cause trouble. He with dignity, withdraws, makes his position clear, and then says, well, okay, this is for God to decide. And of course, that is the tradition, both in Sunni and Shia sources, of the Shura to succeed Umar, that the requirement placed by the Shura is whichever of the two of you, because it comes down to Ali or Uthman, whichever of the two of you is to become the caliph, the agreement must be that you will implement and follow all the sunnah of the first two caliphs. And Ali says, sorry, can't do that. Changes have already happened things have already gone astray, I can't agree to that condition. And therefore, that's one of the principal grounds why Uthman becomes the third caliph.
There is a detailed, well-known account of these events that took place only 3 days before the death of Prophet Muhammad. And these accounts are narrated in certain collections, including that of Sahih Muslim.
Ibn Abbas cries, and he says the tragedy of the Thursday. They asked him, what is it? He said the Prophet asked for the equivalent of a paper and pen, ketufun wa duwat, so that he would write a letter or write a will that Muslims, if they follow it, they will never go astray. People got up to bring him the paper and the pen. The second Khalifa tells them, sit down. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Where did Prophet Muhammad die? The following is quoted in the Khasa'is of Nasa'i from Salama. She said, by Allah, the closest person to the Prophet at the time of the Prophet's death was Ali. Early on the morning of the day when he was going to die, the Prophet called Ali, who had been sent out on some errand. He asked for Ali 3 times before his return. However, Ali came before sunrise, so thinking that the Prophet needed some privacy with Ali, we came out. I was the last to be out, and therefore I sat closer to the door than the other women. I saw that Ali lowered his head towards the Prophet, and the Prophet kept whispering into his ears. Therefore, Ali is the only person who was near the Prophet till the last. Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, moreover, remarks in his Mustadrak that the Prophet kept confiding in Ali till the time of his death, then he breathed his last. Ibn Abbas disputed Aisha's account that said that the Prophet had died in her arms. According to Wilfred Madelung, when Abu Ghatafan told him that he had heard Urwa ibn al-Zubayr transmitting Aisha's claim, he countered, "Are you in your right mind? By God, the Messenger of God died reclining on the chest of Ali. He was the one who washed him together with my brother Al-Fadl ibn Abbas." This is narrated in Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat. Ali said, the Messenger of Allah said, "Fetch me my brother." So I came upon him and he asked me to come closer, and so I did. Thereupon he reclined on me. He continued reclining thus, talking to me, and then the Messenger of Allah breathed his last. Some might not think this detail in history is important, but looking at it can help us to understand how there were different parties with competing interests in the lifetime of the Holy Prophet, and how this has affected the theory of leadership in centuries to come.
I think, first of all, it's no surprise to me that there are different accounts of what I would see automatically as being a time of great sorrow, a time of great upheaval, a time of great emotion, and therefore a degree of chaos. I think it's inevitable. This is the Prophet that they have followed. This is the Messenger of God who has revealed the Quran to them. How can it be that they just sat down and said, "Oh, he's dead, okay." Yeah. You know, I mean, of course there's going to be a huge outpouring of grief. And there will be some people, because there are traditions that go back to this, of people saying to the crowd, if your faith was based on Muhammad, he's dead and your faith is in vain. Now, sort yourself out. If your faith is based on Allah, then the Prophet is dead and your faith goes on. So there would have been those people. We know that there were hypocrites within the community. We know that there were people who were following the Prophet because that seemed like a good political thing to do. So there would have been those people whose faith actually wasn't truly grounded in Iman of Allah. And therefore we can expect them to be deeply disconcerted.
Did Imam Ali remain silent for 25 years, as many scholars from the Muslim world believe? Why did Ali not fight? It is alleged that as he advised Abu Bakr and Omar, this is evidence for him not objecting to what had happened at Saqifa and afterwards. What exactly was the nature of his relationship with Abu Bakr after Abu Bakr came to power? As an example, Sayyid Jafari, in his account of Shi'i history, says that Ali kept aloof from the caliphate of Abu Bakr, whereas before he had been a central figure and very active.
We know that there were a number of instances when Ali ibn Abi Talib vocalized his opposition to the first three caliphs. I think all students of history have come to accept that those Ali and the first three were not best buddies. There are a number of traditions cited in Shi'i books which show Ali as someone who openly and publicly, even explicitly, condemned Abu Bakr in their presence. So again, it goes back to what I said, depends on the historical perspective you take. But we can conclude this, that he wasn't quiet. He did not think that what had happened was irrelevant or a minor incident. He did voice his opposition, and in some cases it was very serious opposition. If you want to look at certain sources which portray or give us some sort of glimpse into the views of Ali, particularly his attitude towards the three caliphs, sources before Nahj al-Balagha, which is quite late, then you may look at the famous text. It's famous but little read, I have to say. A book called Kitab Sulaym ibn Qais, or Kitab al-Saqifa, an 8th century source. There is also Kitab al-Qira'at, an 8th century source. There's Tafsir al-Hibari, an 8th century source. There's Basair al-Darajat, a 9th century source. And those 4 or 5 sources are vital because they portray a particular Shia point of view which is rarely acknowledged or studied amongst modern Shias and in modern academia.
As you have said, Ibn Abbas is the source for revealing this discord between Imam Ali and Umar ibn al-Khattab. And there are, in some sources, a conversation between Ibn Abbas and Umar where Umar actually says very explicitly, I stopped Ali from taking the succession. I knew that he was very favored by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that Prophet Muhammad even indicated that he wanted Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor, but I was the one who stopped it because of X, Y, Z. He was too young, Quraysh wouldn't have accepted it, and so on. What's quite interesting is that this conversation, or these conversations that have been recorded to have taken place between Ibn Abbas and Umar ibn al-Khattab, again, are not very well known. It's, not very, they aren't very prominent in comparison to some of the early Sunni narrations that I mentioned earlier. How is that, again, that these events are not considered so significant?
Traditional accounts tell us that he delayed his public appearance after the death of the Prophet for up to 6 months. And of course, one may agree with this. He was aloof. He was, if you like to use a modern term, he was very cold. He was very distant, when these events transpired. And that itself is very telling. It's an indication that something was wrong. We know, of course, in other traditions that he was of the belief that the first 2 caliphs were not truly following the teachings of the Prophet, and he made this known. In some historical books make this quite clear.
Also, as you mentioned, Ibn Abbas is often the voice in the historical sources for this discontent that existed, or let's say, I'll start again. as you have said, Ibn Abbas is the source for revealing this discord between Imam Ali and Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Yes.
And there are, in some sources, a conversation between Ibn Abbas and Umar where Umar actually says very explicitly, I stopped Ali from taking the succession. I knew that he was very favoured by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that Prophet Muhammad even indicated that he wanted Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor, but I was the one who stopped it because of X, Y, Z. He was too young, Quraysh wouldn't have accepted it, and so on. What's quite interesting is that this conversation, or these conversations that have been recorded to have taken place between Ibn Abbas and Umar ibn al-Khattab, again, are not very well known. It's, not very, they aren't very prominent in comparison to some of the early Sunni narrations that I mentioned earlier. How is that, again, that these events are not considered so significant?
I think one of the most interesting things about Ibn Abbas is he was a very good polemicist, and he was someone whose knowledge of the Quran was very strong. He had a very deep grasp of the Quranic teachings. So in his debates, particularly with Umar and then later with other opponents of Ali, he brought a particular, he shed light on a particular theme in the Quran which is overlooked. And that is, all previous prophets mentioned in the Quran, they considered it to be a divine blessing to be succeeded and inherited by the offspring, by the family. And Ibn Abbas, and this kind of tendency was picked up by later historians such as Wilfred Madlong, Ibn Abbas threw this question at his opponents. Do you know better than the Prophet? Do you know better than Muhammad? Because if Muhammad was truly a prophet of God, then one would expect him to have agreed with the content of the Quran. And whilst the Quran does not explicitly speak of a succession method, it does make very clear that the rules of inheritance, including spiritual as well as political inheritance, are such where a prophet is succeeded or inherited by his family and offspring. And that was, if you like, the primary goal of Ibn Abbas, to take this idea of imamah and to give it root in the Quran.
Some historians say that the event of Ghadir was not an announcement of the succession to the Holy Prophet. It was just urging the companions to make peace with Imam Ali. And they object that if it had been about his succession, how was it that so few people mentioned the event of Ghadir after Abu Bakr had taken power? Also with regard to the event of Ghadir Khum, which we know again has been subject to conflicting interpretations. In your reading, and this is looking at whatever academic texts you may have studied, if someone was to go into studying Islam and wanting to know about the history of Islam, how has the event of Ghadir been portrayed in the text that you have encountered?
It is held in Shia tafsir to be the occasion of the revelation for chapter 5, verse 3, this day I have completed your religion. Whereas in the Sunni tafsir, that is seen to have been revealed in the farewell sermon. So that there's that shift to start with of the importance of the event. And therefore we can see that it's a much more important event in Shia history than it is portrayed in the Sunni sources. We know that there was a certain amount of criticism of Ali, who had just been off on a mission to the Yemen and had come back. And so a typical way that the Sunni sources will deal with this event is to say that the Prophet is publicly proclaiming his support for Ali and saying that, this criticism must stop, as it were. So it's a much more low-key event. Now, if we interpret it from the Shia sources, then, of course, it's an event of mega importance, because it is the occasion of Jibreel coming and saying to the Prophet, if you haven't done this, you've done nothing. It's also the occasion of his being formally declared to be the Mawla in succession to the Prophet in front of a huge number. There is, however, a difficulty with that huge number, and it's one of those questions that I certainly can't answer, but I can ask, and that is, our traditions speak of 72,000, other traditions speak of 100,000 being present at the event of Ghadir Khum, and also of people making their bay'ah to Ali as the commander of the faithful, the successor to the Prophet. If the numbers were really so large, if it was all so explicit, it's only a matter of a few months before the Prophet's death. How do you persuade that sort of number of people to wipe their memories clean? It's really important that we're not just talking about opposing camps of political leadership here. We're talking about, in Shia understanding, the spiritual guidance privileged by the possession of the inner light of Ilham, without which the community will not be rightly guided. Now, really then you can say that from the death of the Prophet, you have got, at the very least, a diminution of the imamate of Ali, even if you maintain, well, he was imam from the last breath of the Prophet, but nevertheless he does not have political power, and things happen within the community which are not according to his discerning of the true meaning of Islam based on Quran and Sunnah.
The event of Saqifa is believed by the Shi'i to be a coup that took the caliphate from Ali ibn Abi Talib, while Sunni texts tell us that it was necessary to have elected Abu Bakr in order to bring calm to the Ummah after the demise of the Holy Prophet. The earliest systematic account of Saqifa was made during the reign of the first two Abbasid caliphs. Would they have had political motives for sponsoring a particular account? Differing and conflicting accounts from this era also do exist. With very little background information on the tensions between the Ansar and the Muhajirun, the event of Saqifa opens with a sudden split between groups, and what is portrayed as a potential split in the Ummah. The Prophet's family are depicted as being so busy with his burial arrangements that they had the door shut and were not engaging with the looming conflict. Hence, Abu Bakr and Umar had to step in order to prevent this split. All of this is on the understanding that Ali was never selected for the succession and played a relatively small part in the final events of the Prophet's life.
Firstly, there is a well-known view amongst historians, particularly Western historians or people writing in European languages, that in the figures of Abu Bakr, Umar, and the third little-known but very important figure at the time, Abu Ubaid al-Jarrah, that these three were some sort of political masterminds. Lamont, for example, who wrote a wonderful work in 1912 about the trio of Abu Bakr, Umar, and al-Jarrah, Abu Ubaid al-Jarrah, and he is of the view that the caliphate, the idea of a caliphate, the idea of succeeding Muhammad, was a political strategy thought of and then applied by none other than Umar ibn al-Khattab. And that Abu Bakr was little more than a front, if you like, a tool utilized by Umar. It is said that Umar had, again based on this particular view, that Umar had planned the succession long before the death of Muhammad, who died in 632. Umar was well aware of the precedents of other tribes, other religions. We know from certain historical accounts that he was intimately familiar with certain Jewish traditions, certain Jewish historical antecedents, and Christian tales and scriptures regarding prophets and succession and so on. So it is possible that some historians may answer the question you've just put forward with the following, that if you subscribe to the view that the Prophet did not have knowledge of the future, which is a view held by perhaps the majority of Sunni theologians, particularly in the late medieval period, then one could simply say that Muhammad could not have known about it because this was a well-orchestrated plan, and its intent was to make this plan as secretive as possible, right? So to some people, when Le Mans came up with this theory, he was accused of pushing a very conspiratorial narrative. But that was picked up later on by other scholars, including, for example, most recently, Montgomery Watt, as well as Wilfred Madlong. There is another view, of course, and that view is favored particularly by Shia Muslims. In Shia theology, broadly speaking, the Prophet or any person considered to be infallible or error-free, knowledge of the unseen, knowledge of future events, knowledge of future calamities and deaths, these are things which are known to the Ma'sum, to the infallible, including the Prophet. So for Shia Muslims, they would maintain that yes, Muhammad should have, and in fact did know about these calamities. He did know about this plan, this secretive happening, the secretive collective that was trying to usurp, to use the term Shia Muslims employ often, to usurp the succession. But religion is about tests, religion is about trials. And Shia theologians have maintained that a true believer is one who is able to discern who the true successor was, to try and investigate, to go through a trial, an intellectual trial, in order to ascertain who the true successor was and to discover this plot, so to speak.
Also, the histories show that there was a fairly clear division between Muhajirun and Ansar, and that the debate over who should be the successor was between these two groups. Again, was it as clear-cut as it appears in this account?
Certainly the way it's been reported, the Ansar, in a sense, although their great qualities are recognised, that the narrative line is that they're getting above their station in thinking of themselves as producing the leader, because they are the Ansar, and their name is used against them. That sense of being helpers or supporters of the Muhajirun is then used against them. They said, well, you know, historically you're devout people, you're very meritorious, you have very good qualities, but your role is to help, not to lead. So in the narrative that we have, which of course is heavily weighted towards Umar's view of events, the Ansar are recognised, but then, if you like, demoted. It's just a group of the Ansar who are in the Saqifa of the Bani Sa'ida. It's not all of them necessarily, and obviously others are with Ali if those accounts are valid, and it's very difficult to say. I mean, I would say there does seem to be a certain elision of Ali from the narrative. However, in some ways that also fits in with the general profile of his character, which is drawn in the early sources, where he is depicted as a particularly devout Muslim. And you would therefore sort of expect him, in a way, to be keeping out of this kind of political bargaining and arguing that's going on, that his priority is looking after the Prophet, not running around canvassing for political support among different tribal groups.
We can also see that although Omar was one of the main narrators of what happened, because Abu Bakr had passed away, and then Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Umar's friend, had also passed away by the time that Ammar ibn Yasir seems to have gone to Umar and implied that he would give his allegiance to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And so Umar gives this speech and he gives the account of what happened, and yet within this speech he still depicts himself as being quite rash and quite a violent personality.
I think it's quite a subtle way of reporting from Umar, but not necessarily showing him in a particularly good light. I mean, it does make the narrative more racy and interesting, but I mean, there is a consistent depiction of Umar as being someone who's impetuous and quite violent, right from before the time of his conversion, when he was supposed to have struck his sister when he found out that she had converted to Islam, sort of split her head open. So throughout the narrative, Umar is depicted as quite a violent and hasty man. And throughout this whole very tense period, we have Abu Bakr depicted as the brake on Umar's behavior, that, Umar sort of comes forward and says things rashly. He denies the Prophet's dead. Abu Bakr says, let's just stop that. That he then goes to the Saqifa and he's sort of ready to leap in, push people around, be quite aggressive. And Abu Bakr's, let me speak first. And he speaks in a much more diplomatic way. And, according to the account, Umar recognizes that Abu Bakr has said what he would say, but that he said it better. And better here seems to mean in a more sort of diplomatic and tactful kind of way, rather than in the aggressive way that Umar might have tackled the situation.
With regard to what happened at Saqifa as well, I remember when I first came into Islam and I was told by people that Abu Bakr was voted in, the vote was unanimous, and that it was a democratic process. It was an early example of democracy. When in actual fact, when again you read the historical sources, you find that there was violence there, and that the number of people who did actually support his caliphate or who gave that bay'ah wasn't quite as many as has been depicted.
We can describe the events as they unfolded and as they are portrayed in historical books. And you're absolutely right. It wasn't a gathering of Buddhist monks. It was quite violent. Some say that there were up to 86 men, tribal elders and chiefs who were in presence. The most conspicuous absentee was Ali. People, of course, have questioned the timing of this gathering, of the Saqifa. Why was it done so fast? Did people fear, particularly the first two caliphs? Had they anticipated a particular revolt or rebellion by Ali? Had they gauged people's sentiment towards Ali and realized that if he pushed for it, or if he had made a proclamation, he may have succeeded Muhammad or inherited the mantle of the Prophet? So there are a number of unanswered questions which have puzzled historians and continue to puzzle historians.
Why do you think Umar himself didn't take the position as caliph? Why was it that, according to some historians, as we've said, he sort of put Abu Bakr forward, or he put his friend Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah forward, and sort of was seen to support them?
Some may speculate and say, while he was the mastermind of this plan to succeed the Prophet, perhaps he wasn't quite certain, he wasn't quite convinced how it will play out, and he needed a precedent, and this is why he pushed for the candidacy of Abu Bakr, to see how this unfolds. This is just speculation, and this is one theory put forward by modern historians. Of course, the faithful, the Muslim faithful, particularly those who belong to the Sunni tradition, would insist that he believed that Abu Bakr was the more deserved of the two, that he possessed certain merits, others did not. And it is true, out of the two, Abu Bakr commanded more respect than Umar amongst the early community because of his age and in his activities.
It can be seen when looking at the early historical texts that there are often conflicting accounts of events, mainly between Aisha and Abdullah ibn Abbas. This raises questions about the theory that Prophet Muhammad left no successor and that Abu Bakr was then elected, or that Prophet Muhammad had hinted that he wanted Abu Bakr to be his successor. As scholars have noted, from the point of view of Arab tradition, a leader's successor was always from his immediate kin, not from among his companions. And from a Quranic point of view, the successor to a prophet was always from among his progeny. Existing Sunni historical accounts that tell of how Omar admitted to stopping Prophet Muhammad from naming Ali in his will must at least call for a closer examination of the sources. Lastly, this matter should not be used by today's political groups to further their aims through indiscriminate killing. Rather, civilizations in Muslim lands need to be cultivated and nurtured for tomorrow's generations.
Ahlul Bayt TV, the holy household for every household.